I move approval.
Second. Second.
All in favor, if you would please raise your hand, aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The meeting minutes have been approved unanimously. Thank you all. Now, Dawn, did you have a question or
Can you hear me, Craig?
Now I can.
Great. Okay. I didn't have a question. I had an opening comment.
Please.
About sort of, that I think I'm somewhat assuming this is the purpose of this meeting. And my comment is that I remain confused by what we're doing. And I don't see a clear path to what we're doing. And let me kind of back up a little bit. As I think some of you know, I served a number of terms on Planning Commission. This appears to me to be sort of a separate track from planning.
Right.
And what concerns me is that we are getting a whole new process, and I see almost competing comp plans. And I'm confused, and I certainly feel like the public could be confused. We've just finished a huge comprehensive plan. So I'm really confused about this process. I can tell you what I think this should be and sort of what I thought this process should be. And I'm not sure that's where we're going from, being in attendance to the meetings we've had thus far. It strikes me that the motion was made, it was passed at the council level to develop a process, a trigger, if you will, for when the urban service boundary should be expanded. And to me, that leads, and I think to planning, that leads to how are we using our land exactly down to the detail of how we're using our land. Are we, and we're told approximately 12 to 17,000 acres within the urban service boundary. So I think it really comes down to just a process of how do we measure the land we're using in all the categories. And I know we've said this before, but I don't understand why we're having more public input and developing a whole nother process. Am I making sense to any others? That's my concern. I don't see how this dovetails into the comp plan, which is going to be before us, in about 1.5 years. Am I right?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Don,
I'm sorry.
Don, I agree with you in some respect, but this was my vision of it, and this is what I think the mayor wants us to do on this committee. There are two main things. Number one, we need to all agree on how much land is available in what certain categories, as far as without sewer or whatever. But we need to know the land and what we have that is available and what we can develop. Number one, within the urban service area. And we need to agree on that. Number two, my mission, and hopefully this is our mission, is to find the key indicators that we go back to visit each year or whenever. We haven't come up with that year, when we're going to do it. But the key indicators that will tell us now it is time for us to expand more land in here. Those are the two things, Don, that I really see us trying to accomplish with this, that would help the commission with their deal.
And I don't know that we're trying to create those key indicators that are objective, that no one can deny the facts behind. We're all here to agree upon those. And those all that information goes to planning, and planning doesn't necessarily have to accept that the urban service area needs to be expanded, nor does council. It's just, are all the key indicators met that suggest that it is needed? Why don't we, Vice Mayor?
So if I can, I saw the need for this meeting, obviously, and I appreciate the fact that the co-chairs, once we discussed this, agreed that it would be useful, and I hope it will be. But I want to kind of follow up, and I think there's two issues that I've raised, and I want to raise them again. And the question in my mind is, how does each of the components of what the consultants have proposed to do, how do they lead to the conclusion that we're looking for? So first, I agree. What we're trying to develop is a set of criteria that would be a trigger. And I think it's important to be precise about the language we use. In my mind, it's not a trigger to expand. It's a trigger to consider whether expanding is the appropriate thing. And the second part of it is looking at the land in the rural area and what effect expansion would have on the economy of our rural lands. So it's not just, we got a set of criteria, we hit those criteria, the default position is we expand. In my mind, it's more, these are criteria that would indicate that we ought to be looking at that and being as comprehensive as possible, and then determining whether this is an appropriate time to really consider expansion. And then the question becomes how much and where and so on, which remain out there. And the other thing, which I've said before, I'll say again, a part of the way I think about this is that the land is a finite resource. And at some point, triggers or not, we will not have any more rural land to expand into. And how we get there and when we get there and et cetera, I think those are the issues. And again, kind of looping back, my concern is I'm not clear about how some of what has been proposed on the timeline by the consultants leads us to being able to make those determinations.
I'd like to rein us back in just a little and turn the floor over to Craig for a bit. Craig's got a brief presentation that talks about the process and the tasks and where we're at to date. And then I think, Don, you're exactly right. The purpose of this meeting was to discuss exactly this and clarify it for everyone involved. But Craig, why don't you take the floor, and then we'll go back to having an open discussion.
Thank you. With your permission, I'll go ahead and share my screen. I just have a few slides, no longer than a 5-minute presentation here. I certainly don't want to detract from the rest of the conversation here, but I just wanted to provide just some of the background if I can. Can everybody see that? Mm-hmm. Okay, good deal. So this is just kind of the catch-all slide that you'll see at the beginning of any of these presentations, just as a reminder of what our current urban service boundary looks like. We have about 85 square miles within the existing urban service area and 200 square miles outside of it due to all of the conservation and preservation efforts the city has taken to date. A lot of this is review, but I thought it'd be worth saying again. What we're proposing is a 9-month study to identify objective criteria for consideration with regard to discussions which may lead to expanding the urban service boundary. And what the Vice Mayor said before is exactly appropriate. The triggers, the objective criteria that we're looking at creating through this process are for consideration of the discussion. They start the discussion. They are not the end all by any means. The scope components of this study are taking a look at existing conditions and growth trends. That'll come to you in the form of a growth trends evaluation and report. That's what the consultants spent a good portion of the last meeting going over. They are working on that now. They're continuing to gather data and working on some analysis for that. There's also a proposed public and stakeholder engagement component. We felt, and the consultant felt, that was an important component because we assumed at some point as we go through this process that the task force would want to know what the community's opinions are about some of the things that are being discussed in this meeting. So that provides the opportunity for us to get out ahead of that and have those answers for you, hopefully, when those discussions come up. The redevelopment and land use scenarios, those are the 3 scenarios that were discussed with you last time. Those are certainly not meant to recreate the comp plan. It's really looking at different scenarios for implementation of the comp plan, from a less aggressive, from a more traditionalist approach based on past land use patterns, and then going forward through that scenario 3, which shows some more aggressive land use scenarios. And then finally, all of this leads to identification of objective criteria that would trigger that discussion that was mentioned. And finally, we would have, at the end of the day, this plan will put into place a regulatory framework for the implementation of this study. So in other words, if the decision through this process is that we'd like to see some more of those innovative land use controls implemented and so on, this study will identify ways that we can get that done. So we have a professional services agreement with Stantec that was executed earlier last month. This is the project schedule that Mark Butler of Stantec had presented to you last time. This is just provided again, just for your reference. It's a 9-month study, and all of the tasks that I just mentioned are just outlined here in a milestone format. And incidentally, I'm glad to share this with the group afterwards as well, these slides, to make sure that you have them and that you have a copy of this timeline as we move forward. And so this task force, as you know, is 19 members. We have 6 advisory committee members and 13 regular members of the task force. It was established, and these are the mayor's words, to help Lexington through a thoughtful database, make thoughtful database balanced decisions concerning its growth, with a goal towards establishing an objective framework for those long-term decisions involving the urban service boundary. So this is, I put together this slide really to provide you with a template, if you'd like, for the discussion today. These are the specific tasks, and going through the project scope that I feel that this task force will be most engaged in. This is by no means comprehensive and all-inclusive, but looking at the scope of work as it stands today, these are the tasks that I feel that the task force would have some good input on. And right now, as you know, you're kind of working through refining and endorsing those growth scenarios that Stantec had presented to you last time. They'll be coming back with additional information on that for your input very soon. Evaluation of the data and analysis, the initial conditions report that they're putting together. We would expect that the task force would have some input on that as well, and some refinement of the language that's in there, as well as any additional information that you feel is necessary. Stakeholder identification is in process. EHI is putting together a list of preliminary stakeholders, and we would be looking to the task force to provide comment on that and to add or remove potential stakeholders from that list as you see fit. Development of survey instrument questions. We had quite a pretty robust discussion, I thought, at the last meeting about how some of those survey questions should be formulated, and how we make sure that we get a good representative sample of the community, if possible, responding to those surveys. We would be coming back to the task force with all of those questions, as well as for you to review the specific survey questions. We would ask that you participate in the public outreach, of course. When we have those meetings, it would be wonderful to have task force representatives there in support of those efforts. We would, and then the last 2 bullet points on here are really where this study, where the rubber hits the road, the refinement and reviewing the objective criteria that the scenarios inform. We would be looking to you to really provide some good input on those. And finally, reaching consensus on the final study as a component of the comprehensive plan. And that's where this is really going, is that this study, the way the goal and the plan is written is that when this study is complete and these objective criteria are completed, this would essentially become an appendix to the plan. This study would replace that placeholder goal that calls for the creation of this study. So those are the specific tasks I put together that I felt you may want to discuss a little bit more today. Like I said, certainly not all inclusive, but it's a starting point for you if you'd like that information. And with that, I'm glad to answer any questions that you have.
Craig,
Yes, ma'am.
the first point on there, dive into that one for me. On that last page.
Certainly, for refining and endorsing a growth scenario.
Right.
So Stantec, and this is all early, so please keep in mind as I'm discussing some of these things that a study exactly like this one hasn't been completed, best I can tell. So this is a little bit of a one-off study. So the information that comes back may create some additional questions that Stantec needs help with answering. But as I understand it, they are going to be using the data that's being gathered toward developing those 3 growth scenarios that they had presented the last time. And those were really, again, one was a kind of a traditional approach based on, based on past development patterns, essentially, in the city. The second one takes a look at Imagine Lexington and implements those criteria that are in Imagine Lexington. Even if they haven't been implemented yet, it moves forward in a speculative way as to what build out of the city, how the vacant land could be used in that regard. And then the third scenario goes a step further than that and takes a look at even more innovative criteria. Now, I can't tell you at this point which one of those is going to be more preferable to this task force, of course, or to the community, but that's really the point of this study and this exercise, is to provide you with that information so you can get an idea of how long the vacant land inventory in the city will last under each one of those scenarios, so that informed decisions can be made in that regard. It's also important to have each one of those scenarios in order to make that decision that will drive those objective indicators. Stantec believes, and I agree with them on this point, that they have to have an idea as a baseline what the full absorption of vacant land, buildable vacant land, looks like before they can really put together an informative list of objective criteria. Otherwise, they would be putting together criteria that aren't necessarily responding to a goal, if that makes sense. And I understand, just as a side note, I understand that none of this on its face is very straightforward. But as we move forward with this, and as the data is presented to you in a graphic way, I believe that we will have the discussions will become more meaningful as we move forward, because the data is being developed by the consultant in a way that we can understand and analyze it and implement it in a meaningful way as well. So,
well, one main factor that we need to all agree on, that they need to give us the information on, is how much buildable land do we have in the urban service area? Because now we don't agree on it at all. And we all need to get on that same page before we can go anywhere else.
Agreed completely. Job one was to obtain all of the GIS shapefile data that the consultant could get through both the LFUCG as well as the PVA and any other source they can find, because they're trying to put together an efficient way to analyze that vacant data and make sure that they're taking a look at highest and best use and all of those factors that will become important during this study.
Can I say one thing? I know that, and you're talking about buildable land. I think that a big part of the contention about that is not just vacant land, but that highest and best use definition and what is underutilized and how that's defined. you know, a lot of that comes back to the real essence of Imagine Lexington. And
Right.
I think that that's something that, try as we might, we're probably not going to get consensus on.
Yeah.
So I want to know if it's the goal of this task force to take a position on that, to say, you know, strip malls versus, you know, medium rise housing or mixed use. Are we going to get that granular about it as we're looking at defining that buildable area? Because that is sort of at the base of everything we're talking about.
So I believe that we'll definitely want the task force to take positions on several of those type of issues. I don't know that it's going to be so granular as to go lot by lot, but I think we're going to have to develop a general rule of thumb type of information. And again, I know I'm throwing disclaimers out all over the place, but we're very early in the study. The consultant's going to be coming back with specific questions in that regard. So right now, a lot of this is inference until they come back with more information.
Anne, Greg, may I make a comment?
Absolutely.
So in my estimation, I understand the reason for doing this. You know, Don and Jim and Chris and Frank, for that matter, have heard me repeatedly claim that the urban services boundary question really hijacks the comprehensive plan process and doesn't give the community the chance to really take on the issues that a comp plan should address. It's all, you know, over subsumed by the urban services boundary issue. So I like the idea of separating it. But on Craig's slide, he said that, you know, the last time that we had an expansion was 24 years ago. I want to remind this committee that that's the only expansion in 63 years. And was that expansion done with a foundation of data? I don't know. I wasn't around. I know Don could speak to that potentially. But in my mind, it still feels a little premature. I recognize that this is going to have to be done, but it feels very premature to consider what triggers may be in place when we haven't even put in place those recommendations from the last comprehensive plan. We have no idea what that's going to look like, you know, on the ground and in terms of rezoning and development densities and, you know, sewerability. So I'm just feeling as though, first off, a presumption that we will expand the urban services boundary, and that's kind of the underlying goal of this committee, is that eventually we will have to expand the boundary, and we just need to figure out what those objective criteria are. I think that may be a little, wrong-minded is too strong a word, but maybe that's the wrong approach. I don't like using that word or thinking about it that way. I like to think about, because to me, that's a very kind of myopic perspective, looking only from the urban perspective, whereas the rural land uses and rural stakeholders may have a completely different, you know, answer to that. And to try to blend those two is a pretty overwhelming task for this committee. Thank you.
Frank?
I think Lynn's has hit on something that we really haven't considered. I can remember back when Pam Miller was mayor, the thought process was that people that own land outside the urban service boundary couldn't wait for the urban service boundary to move out there so they could develop their land. And hopefully we've gotten past that. Hopefully we've gotten past to where we would expand because it's needed for a particular reason, not just because somebody outside the urban service boundary wanted to put their land in. But that leads me to another problem. And the problem that I'm concerned about is this has to go on a parallel track. The implementation of the comp plan has to continue and not wait until the work of this committee. The implementation of Place Builder has to happen. We cannot use this committee, Sustainable Growth Committee, to hijack what we need to be doing as a planning staff and as a planning commission, and that is the implementation of the current comp plan. So any way we approach this, we need to approach it futuristic, not as how to implement this current comp plan. Because if we do that, Craig, we're going to wind up hijacking the comp plan until the next comp plan is ready to be worked on. And we don't need to lose that. I know that's not the intention, but if you get in the weeds too far and you get talking about what's going to tell us when we need to expand, then we're going to have this discussion until we do the next comp plan, and we're going to hijack this current comp plan. And Place Builder has to work because we've already agreed to it. We've already started down that road, and we cannot let the people that don't like Place Builder use this as a wedge in order to stop it. And I didn't want to say that in a public meeting, but I think that is the danger of this. It has to go on a two-path, and we've got to be very narrowly focused on this committee so that we don't hijack what we're trying to do with the current comp plan, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, to be clear, from the staff side and from the consultant side, there is zero intention for this to upend any of the criteria or goals that are in the current comprehensive plan. This is intended to be done in compliance with the comprehensive plan, with an eye towards allowing future plans to really focus efforts on all of the other issues that are out there. This process is intended to take 9 months and to provide the Planning Commission and the council with objective data to make their decisions. But certainly this study is intended to make those decisions or to stop the, put any sort of halt on the comprehensive plan based amendments that are occurring right now, the zoning text amendments and so on, or certainly to replace any future comprehensive plan process. This is intended to be complementary and to allow an even more effective comprehensive planning process that's free of some of the frustration that many of you in the room have likely dealt with in the past, because the very question that you're tackling in this task force, and it's a tough one, can take up a lot of time and energy and really can, it can derail some of the other conversations that need to take place during that planning process. So hopefully that helps.
Greg, if I could rebut just a bit on that, I think the real danger right now is the open public comment sections until we really nail down what we're trying to do. Because implementation of Place Builder is going to be tough enough to do it the way it needs to be done and to initiate the text amendments that need to happen to make that happen. And so I don't want us to do public hearings until we really have something to have a public hearing about that's very narrowly focused. And I'll give you one example of that, and that's when you start developing the corridors and start changing some of these fronts of these subdivisions that front on the corridors. If you give those neighborhoods an opportunity to say, well, maybe the Triggers Committee, as they were going to call it, they're not going to call it Sustainable Growth Committee because the other is easier, then all you've done is make it a tougher job for us to try to implement what we're trying to do. And that's my view.
Frank, I agree. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Vice Mayor.
It's okay. So I want to follow up with the question that Frank just raised. And basically, excuse me. I agree. I think the question of when we get public input and how we get public input is crucial. And it seems to me that we would not want to do that until we have a proposal for a set of criteria and how they would be applied, and have that as something that broadly we want everybody in the community to respond to. I think it would be a mistake to go out and ask general questions about development or about the use of land. These are questions that we've asked before. If I had the if basically you deputize me, I believe I could draft 95% of the public response to those general questions without talking to the public. Now, that may be arrogance on my part, but I think most of us have a good idea of the lay of the land of how people feel about these issues and think about these issues. The question is, what can we put before them that really gives them something different to think about? So the timeline, I'm concerned about the timeline and when the public engagement is scheduled. And I'm concerned about knowing more in detail about what we're going to be going out there and asking people to respond to. Before I quit, Councilmember Bledsoe, if she's still on, has been trying to get the floor for a while, and she's using the blue hand process, which we're not using. So you kind of have to jump in. So if I can, let me see if Councilmember Bledsoe had a comment and what it was.
Thank you, Vice Mayor. I apologize. I mentioned to you all earlier, we set this date that this would be a hard date for me to get. So I am picking up my daughter, who Mr. Robinson, you'll appreciate, is riding horses several hours a week now. I'm spending, she is riding and jumping and showing. So I'm spending more time at a horse farm than I have ever spent with my 9-year-old.
Good.
I just wanted to mention and go back just for the history maybe of the committee. This was started under Mayor Gray, and it was started because council members had different opinions on what were kinds of things to trigger. Some council members felt like affordable housing or housing affordability was the trigger. That was enough. Others felt like it was economic development and sheer revenue. That was a trigger. Congestion triggers. And so instead of having different council members have different criteria on what those kinds of triggers are, I believe the conversation was, rather than it become an us conversation, let's get experts in the room to really talk about what the community feels like are those kinds of triggers. When do we have that tipping point and why? Is it not just one urban area or a rural area? This is a community conversation, like you've mentioned. It is very much a whole use of land and why and when. And I think the presumption is not when we would. I think the criteria that Vice Mayor said is the right one, which is when we talk about it, why would we talk about it? If we talk about it, should we consider under these things because these things have meant? Before COVID, I would have argued that kids being in classrooms and the size of our schools mattered. When you've got 30 kids in a classroom, schools need to expand. They just do. You can't have that be effective very much. In an age of COVID, I know, Frank, you've mentioned this before, offices may not go back the way they did. We may not have the kind of congestion or down or even businesses going in full time that we had before. And you can see that in office space right now. It's just, people aren't moving. Now, 6 months from now, a year from now, will those habits go back and will that change? I think you raised a good point when you asked the question. I'm not sure. I don't know. I don't think any of us really know. But I think that was the point. The point, at least from the council's perspective, and Vice Mayor, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like it was moved to this kind of a committee. So it did not become a committee of 15 individual people trying to decide what they thought were the triggers and why. But it was based on experts in the room with good data and good history, with a community conversation about it to better guide us in that conversation. And I just wanted to say that for nothing else. Thank you, chairs.
Thank you so much. I do totally agree with you on all your points. I also think that when we do question our community about it, the questions need to be very refined and at point, so we don't go off to the right or to the left. I think that's very, very important. But, just all getting on the same page and trying to figure out what those triggers are. And once again, what is our availability of land so we can all agree on that? I think that is so very important as a starting point.
The hard part with public engagement is going to be taking the emotion out of it, which I think that's one of this committee's goals, is to take the emotion out of this process, make it fact-based. My only concern about, I will say, about public engagement, I don't know how to be transparent unless we're engaging the public fairly early in the process. That would be my only concern, is making sure the public knows that we're transparent.
May I make a comment?
Yes.
Thank you. I agree with you, Greg, but I think that I would be concerned that if we pose the sort of binary question of expand or not, I think a lot of the folks that we work with and interact with would imagine that it would look more like what they've seen on the perimeter. It would be an extension of what they've already experienced, out by Costco and Masterson Station. And so I think that in my experience, I've seen that the ability to envision the range of possibilities that I think we're considering is probably more limited when you start engaging lay people who are maybe just sort of reacting based on their experience. So that is one of the concerns I have about sort of public comment about the potential for expansion, is what that expansion could and should be like.
So again, if I can jump back in, again, following up with Chris's comment, I would like this committee to be vetting the timeline and the questions for public engagement. I understand we have professionals who can design those things and make proposals, but I think it's important. I mean, right now we're talking in the abstract about public engagement. And it seems to me that a part of the role of this committee is to vet those things. And we can't do it until we have something kind of specific to look at. So that's, in my mind, that's one of the ways that we ought to be proceeding, so that we don't, well, I don't know exactly how to phrase this, but basically, so that we don't end up looking back and saying, oh, if we had talked about that, I don't think we would have done it that way.
Right. I agree, Vice Mayor. Craig, can we put that to our people and tell them that we would like to see the questions before they proceed?
Certainly, it's beyond that. They're fully on board with that. That's been part of the discussion with Stantec's team since day one on this, is that any sort of survey questions that go out there into the community, the discussion that occurs in any meetings that we have, they are more than comfortable. They actually, with getting your input, they want to hear that input before they proceed. So that's the full intention, is to bring all of that back to this task force for review and input before it goes out into the community.
And also their timeline.
Certainly. Yeah, definitely. They are still refining that. Everything's in conceptual form right now, but you will know all of those things are going to happen well in advance of them happening. We're trying to stay on that 9-month timeline, but we feel that the meetings of this task force happen frequent enough to where you should have more than enough advance notice and time to provide input before anything happens. So we're more than glad to proceed in that manner.
And Frank, I just want to reiterate that we want to support the comprehensive plan and your all's processes. And this is in no way an interference with that. I promise you, we're trying to support you, if anything.
I agree with that. Our chairman's not on today, and I just felt like that he would want to say that, because it's easy to postpone something. Well, we'll make that decision 9 months from now. We'll make that decision a year from now. We've got to make decisions now to support the current comp plan. I didn't say we weren't. All I wanted to do was to get that out there to say we need to do this on dual tracks.
No, I totally agree with you. And I'm sure the rest of the committee does as well. Don, you have anything else that you'd like to share?
Can Can you hear me? Okay.
We got you.
Greg and Ann, this has helped clarify my concerns to a certain degree. Craig, if you would send us that short outline, you know, that would be helpful, that you started the meeting with, just so I've kind of lost sight of that we have those down. That's helpful. And the questions today have helped me. It seems, some less chaos than I began with a sense of things. And I think I sense a bit of a consensus here in we seem to have similar questions, and I'm okay with the answers for now. Yes, thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
Absolutely.
Thank you. So in light of the reduction in scope associated with the bids coming in over, Craig, are there any concerns about not the thoroughness, but are we going to get the scope that we need to really have a document that is going to function the way that we need for the budget that we have?
We're certainly.
Really hope so.
I know we hope so, but just since we're speaking privately,
has streamlined the scope of services for this. What you really see happening with that current scope is that we've taken some of the tasks that were being handled by the consultant and we brought them in-house. We're providing more GIS support. We're doing a little bit less in terms of those community outreach meetings. That was a very robust process when we first proposed it. It's more streamlined now. We still believe we can get adequate public input, but it's a more streamlined process than it was before. So all of the primary components are still there. There's just the work is being spread out amongst more people, and internally the city staff are doing a little bit more than they were in the initial scope of work.
Okay, can I ask one more question? Sorry. So in terms of what Frank said about not hijacking the comp plan, I know that the next comp plan is underway, and it sounds like we're not even that far off from the next comp plan. So is this being set up in such a way that it is going to be easily updatable, either in-house or through fairly inexpensive means to keep this current as we're moving forward?
The intention is that this will be regularly updated. It will have to be, because as you know, any sort of comprehensive planning process is dynamic. Community attitudes about development and land use change over time. We want to make sure that we can make adjustments to all of this information over time. We also want to make sure that the data can be updated. And so that's one of the discussions that we had with the consultant team early on, is that not only do we want to make sure that the data can be updated, but we want to make sure that the data can be updated internally by staff so that we won't need to go through this, repeat this effort, on a regular basis. So that's the goal. And they're doing that even to the extent where they are contacting me and asking questions about, will we have access to certain data sources later on, or are we willing to get certain subscriptions to have certain information and things like that. So they're having those early conversations with us to make sure all of this is repeatable and updatable, and we can continue forward into the future with this.
Good.
My feeling is, excuse me, hello? My feeling is, if we don't accomplish this, do what you're suggesting, then we really have failed as a task force.
Yeah, absolutely.
If we don't have a repeatable process here, we really have wasted a lot of time. So I really think I think everyone agrees that's what this process is about, is to get something that can be repeatable, that can inform growth and development for the future, and then it's always updated and current. That's certainly my thinking. Yeah.
Bryce.
I concur, and when we were talking about the public engagement, it seems like we're walking this path, that the results of this of our project and task force will hopefully enter into our general public discourse where we're talking about things and educating people as part of our general public relations campaign about the results of this. We'll start now using similar words across our community about, oh, our sewerability on this side of town is X, or we're able to expand here Y, and try and take some of this information and put it into our general public, I guess, nomenclature would feel like an objective of the committee.
Lynn, I think I saw you raise your hand a bit
ago. Yeah, I just wanted to say, I guess from my perspective, what I am thinking we are going to be doing is looking to maximize development density, sewerability, growth scenarios that will suggest that when we reach a certain threshold, whatever it may be, we need to explore other options. And that other option may be expanding the urban services boundary. To me, that feels, and Frank and Don can better speak to this, but it feels as though it is a very, I used the word myopic previously, just kind of with blinders on, without respect to what's happening in the rural areas and the rural stakeholders. That the city is coming your way because we've hit these thresholds. I think we need to absolutely positively explore every potential scenario about development maximums within the urban services boundary before we even think about expanding it.
I think that topic deserves some more discussion because I'm not sure I agree with it as far as maximizing the density within the urban services area that exists. I mean, I sure don't want to fight the fight of an extra dwelling in someone's backyard amongst this committee, a tiny house.
Well, I think that's an inevitable. I think we need to look to those kinds of scenarios. I know there is pushback. Planning Commission has tried that. Maybe that is part of the public relations campaign. There are certain parts of towns that are more amenable to higher density than others. And I think those are we need to kind of look at a very kind of large scale to figure out what parts of town can better support development density than others.
I agree with that. I think that the challenge, in my mind, at least at a high level, is that those areas of town that can support a higher density are by and large going to correspond with the lower income parts of town. And I think that there's going to have to be a more holistic look at it than just saying, well, we're going to densify places like Versailles Road, Cardinal Valley, North Limestone, East End, Winburn. I think that the historical patterns have been that you can't try to densify Chinaway because they have too much money and too many lawyers.
Yeah.
But I think that there is going to have to be some consensus on this committee about what that definition of highest and best use densification, what that's going to look like in order for us to understand, at least understand common terms as we're talking about what that means and what those triggers are.
I'm having a hard time rezoning existing neighborhood zones. I don't think that's
I think that part of it is there are a lot of neighborhoods that are just off limits because they have HOAs that are incredibly, legally defensible, and so I think those are probably just off the map completely unless they expire. I mean, there are pretty large swaths of the south side of town that were built after, in the 1990s and after, where HOAs are going to maintain that probably in perpetuity. Am I right?
That's a fair statement. But if I lived in an R1C neighborhood, I don't know that I'd want. I don't know that I would want this committee to change my zone to an R3 or an R whatever. Vice Mayor, I see you smiling.
Well, yeah, we just did that. We just changed the R3, 4, and 5 and allowed for more density in those zones. consistent with the intention of the comprehensive plan to focus on density. And that's, everybody in the community may not have understood what exactly was going on and what we did, but the comp plan basically says density. We're going to work on it, and we're going to figure out how to do it in a way that has the least negative impact on the existing neighborhoods. Now, we're far from finished with that conversation. And for what it's worth, I don't think that's this task force's responsibility.
It's not.
However, when we get to the point of deciding something about criteria, and I'll just put in a plug for one of my favorite things, and that is that all criteria are not created equal. And so I think they need to be weighted when we finally get down that road. But in any event, when we start talking about criteria, I think it'll become clear that whatever criteria we choose, they have implications for how we will develop. And I guess I've been presuming that's what these three scenarios are about. They basically are a heads up to the community that says, we can keep doing what we're doing. We can go for slightly more density, or we can go for a great deal more density. And that's one of the things that I'm interested in seeing how the community responds to. So, you know, I don't know what the bottom line is, but what may, I don't know, I think this conversation is making it clearer. But in my mind, when we're done, what we should have is a set, again, I'll say weighted, but a set of weighted criteria that indicate to the community, these are the things that need to be taken into account when we're thinking about our growth patterns. And here's the data that we've developed to this point that informs that set of criteria. So if it's about available land, how do we define that? And how important is that in our consideration? And part of the reason I wanted to have this conversation was I want to be sure that what we have tasked the consultants to do will all be relevant to that final goal. And that if there's some things that you can't figure out how they get us there, maybe they ought not to be doing those things.
I'll be very interested in the definition of available land then.
Absolutely. But I like your idea, Vice Mayor, of weighting those objectives. I think that's right on. And I don't think anybody could say it better than how you just said what we're here to do. So Craig, I need you to record that.
If I may respond to that, that's one of the, when we
could get back Councilperson Bledsoe's statement also to be repeatable.
Right.
Regarding weighting criteria, that's one of the discussion items that came up when this task force reviewed the scope language before you re-advertise the RFP. That language is actually in the scope of work now. The criteria that come before you will have recommendations for how those will be weighted for your input. So that will definitely be in there and come back before you.
Dennis?
Yes, I'd like to address your comment about available land. I think one of the things I hear people talk about underutilized land, vacant land, available land. It's kind of like affordable housing. It means so much to so many different people. I think our first thing we need to do is define what is available land. We're not going to get an agreement on anything if we can't get there first.
Agree.
I agree. And I think that one path to do that is to be clear that there are, pick a number, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 categories of land that right now people call available, or they call it vacant, or they call it whatever. And I hearken back, for what it's worth, a little story. I hearken back to the work that I helped facilitate back in the 90s when Mayor Miller was mayor, and Don Robinson and Frank were present at those meetings. And one of the exercises that group went through, they literally looked at every single parcel of land in the city. And we had the people in the room who basically could tell you, yeah, that's Joe's land. You know, until he passes away, nothing's going to happen to that land. And yeah, this piece of land's been sitting there for 30 years or 20 years, or it's good for this, or it's not good for that. But I think we need a way to categorize the various things that we now put under very loose terms. And then that will help. And we may not be able to get 100% agreement about what goes in each category, but we maybe can knock off about 95% of the land out there. And we will not be talking past one another, with some people saying we've got 17,000 acres and some people saying we have 5. That's too big a gap. And I think we can narrow that with analysis.
I agree.
So if I can just add to that, just to provide clarification, if it's okay. One of the, I mean, we have largely the same scope as we had initially, but I think one of the assumptions moving forward is that with the scope and the dollars being spent on this study, it won't get down to a parcel by parcel approach. That's just been kind of a truth as we've gone through this. Now there's going to be large tracts of land that certainly are going to have to be considered, but one of the reasons the consultant is using GIS and some of the other tools that they're using is so they can provide some of those kind of rule of thumb approaches to this approach. So I just wanted to be clear at this point that there will not, to my knowledge at least, at the end of the day, be a comprehensive inventory of every single parcel in the city that is vacant, because I believe the cost of that to put that together would be very prohibitive, and I think the timing for that would far exceed the 9 months that we have together. So just want to put that out there. Appreciate it.
I don't see that we have any members of the public in this meeting. Is that a true statement? So we can forego public comment then. Does anyone else have any comments?
Co-chair, there are 12 or 11 attendees.
Okay, I just didn't see them on my participant list then. Do we have any folks from the public that would like to comment?
And typically what you've done in past meetings at this point, if there's an attendee in the room that would like to speak, they would just raise their hand and then be recognized. Councilmember Plomin is an attendee and had raised her hand and subsequently lowered it. With your permission, I'd like to bring her into the room just to ensure that she wants to speak. Councilmember Plomin, you've been brought into the room as a panelist. If you'd like to make any comments, you can unmute.
You're on mute, councilperson.
I said I wasn't really trying to raise my hand. I was trying to look to see who was on the call. But thus far, I think there's been a lot of great comments made. And this is, starting off on the journey. And I have a keen interest because representing the 12th district, which is 73% of the landmass out there, this discussion is really important. And so I will be on these calls, and moving forward, perhaps I'll have some comments that as I listen. But right now, I am just listening and watching you launch.
Thank you
for the recognition.
Thank you.
Greg, can you tell if there's any other folks from the public that want to comment?
If there are any other attendees that would like to speak, please raise the blue hand and you'll be called upon. I'm not seeing any, co-chair.
Okay. Any other participants have any input that they would like to present?
If I can, before we close, I just want to express my appreciation for the co-chairs being willing to listened to my reasoning for why this might be useful and for being flexible. And not just the co-chairs and Craig as staff. And I think, well, from my perspective, I think it's been helpful. I hope that other people feel the same way. But thank you for doing this.
I agree.
Thank you.
Vice Mayor, I agree. Craig, thank you. This has helped to clarify some of my questions and confusion about the process.
Yes, sir.
This helps. Thank you.
Well, please, I hope that you all will speak up when there is, concern about the direction that we're going, because we need to get there all together. Sure. Because this is a really major task that we have taken on here. So we need everybody's knowledge and support to get us where we need to be.
I think it was Frank that said we need to have, or maybe it was Ann that said we need to have Dennis Anderson and Frank Penn agree upon the end result here, that it's acceptable.
I think we can do that.
I would love it. With that being said, are there any other issues or concerns we need to discuss before we adjourn today?
Thank you.
If not, do I hear a motion to adjourn?